Sebastian held his new wand firmly in his grip, and even though he exuded confidence on the outside, there was a hint of trepidation inside. For the past few weeks, Lady Decker had taken the time to get him physically back to a more spry state. But magically, it had been a long while since he had cast any spell. A day ago, she had instructed him to do a few practice runs with his newfound wand, but she had restricted him to softer, calmer spells. She was also very vague about such a wand's origins. All the information she divulged was that it was practically consequential and unique, made by the first Chotes as they stepped foot on new soil. Only a handful of times had he wielded this wand, and despite his strong connection with it, it seemed to have a personality, a mind of its own, as if it expected him to perform within its ideals. He would almost call it fickle, but as soon as he had pulled it out of its holster on this stage, his intentions clear, the wand responded enthusiastically, thrumming in his palm, just as it had in his prison cell that fateful day. As he stood and was at the ready, they bowed as was customary. Lynette looked at him harshly. The early haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by solid focus, fire burning in her strange golden eyes. Good, he thought, would rather face her at her best. An actual test of skill was what he desired. He made the first move, striking a bright lightning cast at her left foot. He wanted to startle her and couldn't resist satisfying his curiosity about how hard he could go with his spells. She remained unfazed, shifting ever so slightly and momentarily casting a silent shield around herself before unleashing a torrent of bright spells. They fired from her wand rapidly, each with pinpoint accuracy, impressively from the distance she had been at. That wasn't all, though. Not a word left her mouth. She was a non-verbal caster. Interesting. His smirk grew. You are a natural non-verbal, he commented. A rare skill indeed, my dear. She narrowed her eyes and unleashed a flurry of flames from the tip of her wand, aimed right at his heart centre. Damn, he thought, his smile faltering as he threw up a shield. Protego! He shouted, and it barely held, and the heat pummeled him, the sickening sound of the magical barrier cracking under the stress. He somehow managed to keep it up, panting now as sweat trickled down the bridge of his nose. I see you like heat. Might I return the favour? He chuckled darkly. Bombarda, he commanded, and effortlessly a fiery ball of fury was returned at her. The sheer intensity of the attack threw both of them off balance, the sheer force pushing him back a few inches while she threw her body forward, narrowly missing the attack as her whole front slammed into the stage below. She recovered quickly, hopping up, but a fine sheen of sweat also graced her brow, like his. He wasted no time, throwing out cast after cast. His blood boiled with adrenaline. Lynette barely escaped each spell, hex and charm. Her stupid dress proved more troublesome as it restrained some of her movements. Her breath became laboured as she thrashed back with equal force. Their spells collided in a brilliant show of liquid light, the room now smelling of smoke and sweat, the tension so thick one would need a sword, not a knife, to cut it. Feisty thing, aren't you? He panted, smirking. I have to say this has been a delight. Do you ever shut up? She hissed, clearly not liking his childish tactic of trying to rile her, if only to make her stumble once. I'm afraid not. A trait of mine, really. Though I think you're right. It's perhaps time we end this little game. Defindo, he bellowed, and the sound of blades whizzing past her ear was all she comprehended before being blasted off this ripped stage. Her dress at the bottom hem and collar, the fabric fluttering through the air as she fell to the cold tiled floor, her very breath rushing from her lungs. It took her a moment to comprehend what had just transpired. In the last year, not one Eduela had managed to knock her literally off her feet with such force. She gasped, trying to gulp down air as she heard the sound of heels dashing to her side. The once low light of the chandeliers now felt blinding as Rebecca's familiar face came into view, blocking out the light momentarily. A look of horror and shock splashed across her features. "Good gods, Lynn! Are you all right?" she shouted, helping her to a sitting position. "Can you stand, dear? Do you need a hearty healer potion?" Her gloved hands fluttered over Lynn like a mother hen. I'm fine, Becca. Just had the wind knocked out of me is all," she muttered, still in disbelief, it seemed. "He beat me. He—" Her mind stalled as the wizard in question suddenly kneeled before her, but instead of the smug expression she expected to see, he looked concerned. "How many fingers am I holding up?" he said, holding up his hand. His eyes suddenly scanned her as if looking for any signs of injury. She almost swore that there was a tint to those cheekbones. Suddenly, he covered her with his jacket. It was then she realised she was shaking, and quite indecent. The last spell had done a number on her dress, shredding the collar so far down that you could see the valley of her cleavage. She was in quite a state of dishevelment. She shot up, then, wobbling unsteadily on her legs, he gripped her forearms tight as if worried she might fall. It was then Lynette finally came to her senses, her face growing hot with humiliation, and not just because she was exposed right now. The shame of such a defeat was like an open sore to her pride, and she shoved him away. "Don't touch me," she ground out through bared teeth. He held up his hands in instant surrender. "There's no need to get testy, love," he said, frowning. "My intention was not to maim you, but to—" he began, but she cut him off. "Bullshit! You knew damn well what you were doing up there, and I don't think you realise just the responsibility you've inherited with that wand. To have it choose you is a gift, and to see you it with such carelessness only proves my point," she shouted. Rebecca raised her brows. Cursing in such a way was unlike her friend and fellow dueler. Sebastian also seemed equally surprised, and his brows lowered. His mouth settled into a deep frown, his eyes darkening. "Prove what exactly? All I did up there was best you, love. Something I think you're taking quite poorly by the looks of it," he chastised. "My point is that you used not one, but 2 banned spells during that duel. A shallow move in any honourable witch's or wizard's eyes. You, good sir, are unfit to wield such a wand." She couldn't stop her frustration from rising. "And you still have the gall to act as if you care? As if you didn't intentionally cast those spells?" His jaw tensed, and he stepped closer to Lynette, staring down at her as if she were a child that needed scolding. But she would have none of that, matching his energy by straightening her spine and taking a challenging step towards him as well, so close she could smell his perspiration and cologne, which smelled of bergamot and sandalwood, hating the way it stirred the heat in her chest. Lynette swallowed the strange feeling. They stared heatedly at one another until the sound of a throat clearing caused both of them to snap their heads to the side. "We should get you to the infirmary, dear. You're bleeding, it would seem," Rebecca said, clearly uneasy with the tension swirling around the room. Lynette and Sebastian looked down in shock to see that a small puddle of blood had dribbled onto the polished floor, starkly contrasting with the white marble. Her left side, it would seem, was deeply gashed, and Lynette had been in such a rage that she had not even noticed, and neither had Sebastian. "Of course," she whispered, wincing as the pain finally registered. It stung as she gripped her side. She swore out of the corner of her eye. She saw his hand twitch, but she turned away, noticing his expression had gone from infuriated to guilty. Good. Let him feel such a way, she thought. And Rebecca gently took her arm, guiding her to the main doors. She spared him not a backward glance as the two witches as they could for the building headed as Quick's infirmary, leaving Sebastian in the now quiet hall. He sighed, balling his hands into fists at his side, then pulled out the wand from his holster once again. As he looked down, his expression remained dark. He had made many mistakes in his past, and had so many regrets. He let out a frustrated growl, shoving the wand back in its confines, whispering a single word in the echoey silence. Damn. Sebastian opened the door slowly to his new living space. According to the deal he had struck with Lady Decker, he was to live in the duelling houses for the time being. He sighed, sitting on his new downy feather bed, the furniture giving out a soft squeak as he flopped down. The room was already decorated to his liking, thanks to a few charms he had brushed up on. In the centre of his space was, of course, his bed, which had a plush quilt to it, the fabric enchanted to make the fearsome Wumpus cats on them stalk around the other patterns of the quilt. Above was a canopy, also enchanted to have a mini swirl of stars above, just like his days at Hogwarts in the Great Hall. His stomach twisted at the memories that threatened to flood him. He sighed profoundly, turning to his side. He saw that he had a few trinkets here and there, including magical beasts' skulls, rare stones, and a few books, which sat atop his writing desk. The walls were dark plum, giving the room a posh, lush look. Finally, next to his own private bathroom was his window, where his new owl and companion sat perched and sleeping. He had named him Bartholomew, and while he was the crankiest owl he had ever interacted with, he had grown a soft spot for him. Before he parted from Scotland, Lady Decker had somehow acquired some of his old belongings from his abandoned home in Felcroft. How she knew all this was still a mystery, but he had learned only after a few short days with her that it was best not to ask too many questions. As he lay there in his new, tranquil space, his mind wandered to her, the way she had turned away from him in disgust. It had left him feeling that familiar sting, a wound that he was all too accustomed to. Guilt festered inside it like an infection he couldn't rid himself of. Before he could have a full-out pity party, there was a knock at his door, a few soft raps on the wood. "Come in," he called out, and the door opened to reveal George, the building's house elf. A silver tray floated at the tiny old elf's side, and a soft blue teapot with a cup, a few slices of bread and Swiss cheese filled it. "George has just come with some of Master Sallow's favourite tea and some food. The lady insists you keep improving your overall health by daily meals, sir," the old creature said. Sebastian nodded. "Thank you, George. You can set it by the bedside," he said, gesturing to the intricately carved end table. As the old house elf floated the tray over and gently placed it on his nightstand, Sebastian poured some spiced ginger tea, savouring the first sip like heaven in a cup. It might as well have been. "Brewed to perfection as always, George," Sebastian whispered, taking a small bite of Swiss on wheat. He chewed slowly, still mulling over that expression Lynette had given him. That, and the little snafu with her clothing in the end. "Something on your mind, sir?" George asked nervously, wringing his bony hands. Sebastian suddenly choked on his tea, sputtering as the hot liquid burned his sinuses. Why do you ask?" he said, trying to clear his airway. George thinks your mind is still on that duel between you and Mistress Lynn. For the victor of such an accomplishment, you seem—" He trailed off. "You heard that then, Sebastian mused, raising a brow. Everyone, including George, did yes. Once the mistress stepped into the infirmary, words and whispers spread like wildfire, I'm afraid. The house elf muttered. Sebastian frowned, swallowing that familiar guilt. Is she all right? Yes, Mistress Lynn is all healed for now, good as new, George said brightly. Sebastian let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Good, he mumbled. Though George suspects her pride may still be somewhat wounded, George stated. Mistress Lynn has been undefeated for the past year, it would seem. Sebastian took another bite of cheese, chewing slowly in thought, then washed it down with another gulp of tea. He could still clearly remember how she refused to back down, those round, honey-laced irises burning hotly into his, that delicate mouth set in a deep, defiant pout. Even at her meagre height, which he suspected was around 5'3", she had tenaciousness, no fear, and such passion. He liked that, albeit irksome. Before George leaves, you be sir, I have a message from Lady Decker to pass on. George pulled a note from his small, shabby pocket. The ink still looked damp on the parchment. A note? He asked, taking it quickly and skimming through the eloquent cursive. It was a formal invite to a gathering of Wayward Wand's newest and oldest members for a Yule celebration, and he tensed. This would be his first real exposure to the outside world since, well, the month leading up to his former imprisonment. Mistress Decker, she strongly implores you to attend. George stuttered, which was lingo for, you have no choice. He sighed, walked over to his writing desk, scribbled his response, and then formally handed it back to George. I'll need some formal attire, he said, trying to ignore the impending thought of being thrown to the wolves. Dealing with Lady Decker's granddaughter and heir was one thing, but a room full of American Wizarding Society's upper elite was a bit different. He'd be out of his element, both culturally and status-wise. If there was one thing he thought he could manage, it was the illusion of confidence. Of course, sir. Lady Decker mentioned she shall have someone escort you to Miss Penelope Pinwell's garment shop later this evening. George smiled toothily. However, Sebastian had to work hard to keep the frown off his face. Despite his newfound freedom, he was still on a tight leash. No matter. He could wait, he could play the long game. All good things come in time, he thought, and with the alternative looming over his head, pushing his luck would be a foolish mistake, and he wouldn't make the same mistake twice, not ever, again.